CSIRO has reorganised recently, and we have a sustainable agriculture flagship. So I'm the deputy director of that flagship, and that flagship is about trying to direct CSIRO's research nationally around these big issues that you've been hearing about this morning. And so in the talk today, I'm going to touch on much the same as what Roberto and others have mentioned about what the challenges are in front of agriculture globally and what's that mean for you as farmers in Australia. So to look at this global food demand challenge, look at the efficiency of current production systems, and I want to look at dryland wheat in Australia. I can do that. Right. Dryland wheat in Australia, and I want to compare that with what's happening in China and Zimbabwe, and if I get time to look at that other major systems around the world. And I think when CSIRO stands in front of producers like yourself, we should be talking about what are the next technologies that you want to see in the paddock in the next 5, 10, 20 years' time. We heard a fantastic story around the reach of no-till farming systems in Latin America, in Argentina, and in Australia. But what are the next technologies that you guys will want to see? So, you've seen population. Roberto put up population growth. This is a bit of analysis that we did. If you want to look at going back up 300 years about what's happened in terms of the demand for food. So the y-axis there is not population. It's the global food production demand, petacalories per day. If you look at, and it's mainly driven by population. So the scenarios you can see up there. If we what the projection for population is going to be. Is it going to be 8 billion or 9 billion by 2050? And as others have said, as affluence grows in Southeast Asia and China and India, the number of calories that people are going to consume is going to increase. The impact of biofuels and what's happening with things like wastage. If you add all that up, you get these projections out in the future, and you can see it's from quite scary exponential growth to some flattening off, depending on what scenario you look at. And there's a nice graph here that looks at this. This isn't an impossible task. Well, it can't be an impossible task because the reality is there's going to be this increased population, and we're going to have to feed the world if we want to maintain stable society around the world. So if we just look at the last 40 years versus the next 40 years is these projections. And the story doesn't look so daunting in some ways. So over the last 40 years, the increase in production demand has only risen by 129%. But if we look forward in the next 40 years, that outer envelope says it's only 71%. So looking forward in a percentage term, we have a lower challenge than in the past. But if we look in terms of the absolute production increases needed, you can see that it's going from 14 petacalories per day increase to 17. So the actual amount of food that we have to produce in the coming years is going to increase. Now, if you just look at that, people talk about doubling production. That's difficult without saying, well, how are we going to get there? So this idea of this mega wedge of food demand as we look out into the future, and try to look at how we might address that. So it's not just one wedge. We also have to, in terms of your production systems, implement practices that are going to avoid losses in these systems. So, whether that's biotic stresses, such as weeds or disease, or losses in the system. But another way to meet this future challenge is also to reduce the demand. So, to tackle things like obesity and diets in modern countries, or developed countries like ours, and developing countries. So there's these three areas that there has to be investment through research and policies by governments. And if we want to look at strategies to how do we address these, there's a whole range. So it's not like there's this big challenge out there that's going to be impossible to deal with, this huge increase in population. There's a number of ways that we can do it. So we can, as I say, reduce the demand trajectory by reducing waste, looking at the issue of biofuels or bioenergy and trying to come up with smarter ways of dealing with that rather than just a direct substitute between food and energy crops. And improved nutrition, food and health outcomes. I think as people in the room here are pretty interested in what are we going to do to fill the production shortfall. Is there possibilities in the globe to expand the land footprint? I'd like to agree with Roberto and say probably not, if we want to maintain some of the natural ecosystems around the world. What's the opportunity to use our water more efficiently around the world? There is water resources, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that are poorly utilised at the moment and could be better utilised. Intensifying existing land use, closing yield gaps, and that's what I want to go on to here, is how close are farmers in Australia and elsewhere to the yields they should be achieving. Raising the resource use efficiency, breaking yield ceilings. I think that's an area that where science has to play a role. Is there possibility of going forward into new production regimes that are going to increase what you can produce off the same land with the same amount of resources? And of course, avoiding losses from the current production systems. Just as a little example of this is an example of some work that I was involved with in Bangladesh in over 6 years from 2003, where it's hard to believe in a country of 170 million people and not much bigger than Victoria, that they have fallow land, so land that's not used for production purposes in these southern regions down here near the Sundarbans. And one of the reasons why it's not used is because there was agroecological analyses done to suggest it was not suitable for traditional dry season crop production. So in many of the Indo-Gangetic plains, they grow rice during the wet season and irrigated wheat during the dry season. And so this area was not suited for that, so they grow rice in the wet season but nothing in the dry season. So you basically see in this area these underutilised lands, or what we call fallow lands. So this Australian Development Support Project in Bangladesh over these 6 years looked at where they could grow wheat there, and showing that with they can get pretty good with the current germplasm out there and management practice. They can get 3 to 4 tonnes per hectare of wheat with one irrigation, 2 to 3 tonnes dry land, and even when there was very high salinity, they were getting 2 to 3 tonnes per hectare. So there's this approach of how can we use technology to better utilise these lands and this resource in places like Bangladesh. So the question that you must ask is, well, what does it mean for us as farmers in Australia? And if we look back the last 30 years, you can see there's different strategies that have been put into play and different technologies that you use that can do a number of things. When you can, as a farmer, you can close your yield gap. If this solid line here represents the production frontier or production response to inputs, say nitrogen fertiliser, I think much of Australian farmers have improved their efficiency. So for a certain level of inputs they might have in the past produced a certain yield or a certain production. They've closed that gap, so they're closer to the efficiency frontier. And there's the number of strategies that allowed farmers to do that. But the other pathways you can take is to create new efficiency frontiers or production frontiers. I feel like this is dropping out, isn't it? It is, okay. Hopefully it's not too annoying. So you can either become more efficient in how you use your resources, or, as I said earlier, you can find technologies that are going to... is it worth using? It's too difficult. I'll just talk loud. I'm a loud voice. So as I said, is to find technologies that are going to create new production frontiers. So to break the current attainable yields, that ceiling, and create new opportunities to produce yield. So in the past, conventional breeding and conservation agriculture, zero-till, has been some of the strategies that enabled farmers to do that. And so Michael showed Australia relative to the rest of the world in terms of yield But in actual fact, farmers in Australia have done a fantastic job of tripling or quadrupling yields over the last century. So you can see this classic rundown as farmers used the natural fertility of the soils and ran that down and then started to look at new ways of farming, including fertiliser. And then there's been this steady increase, more likely rapid increases followed by some plateauing, followed by some other breakthrough technologies plateauing, and until we got to the 2000 and then got hit by the millennium drought. And you can see that yields in Australia have dropped over those last 10 years. And a key driver here, much as we saw in Argentina, is the adoption of no-tillage. So this is some work done by Rick Llewellyn, tracking the adoption of no-till through most of the major grain growing areas in Australia. And you can see that we're up to, many places up over 90% of the land area is no-till now. There's still some areas that, down as low as 50%, but you'd have to say that Australia really has adopted the no-till revolution. Is it going to work? Right. So I want to have a look at these three case studies, Australia, China and Zimbabwe, to have a look at, well, what's the difference between these. And I'm going to report on a data set here that comes out of Yield Profit. Yield Profit is an online management system that allows Australian farmers to plug their information in, and it'll give a forecast of what the yield will be and what the consequences of management decisions are. But it's an excellent database to be able to diagnose how Australian farming is performing. So there's as I say, a subscriber system run by the Birch Crocker Group using technology developed by CSIRO and others called ABSIC. And in this particular data set, there's about 330 commercial wheat crops grown over 3 years. I've since done this analysis with over 1,000 wheat crops and hasn't changed the story much. And don't worry about the X, Y axis, but this really represents a production frontier, but it's normalised for the level of input and the level of yield. So you read it much like a production response curve to, say, nitrogen. And this represents each one of those crops, how they're performing. And if we look at it, a simple analysis, we can see that into these four categories, that there's 43% of these crops invested a level of inputs to achieve their maximum yield, and they achieved 80% of that yield. So they invested to achieve a high yield, and they got within 80% of that yield. The yield gap was very low. Another 21% of these crops didn't invest the level of inputs to achieve close to the maximum yield, or the achievable yield they could have achieved in that season. But they still achieved, for the level of investment they did, still achieved yields within 80% of what they could attain for that level of investment. And then you have these other two sectors, people that invested highly in terms of their inputs but underachieved in their production, and crops that underinvested in their inputs and underachieved in what they are able to achieve. So these data suggest that for this selection of crops, that 64% of these crops across grown from Western Australia through South Australia, Victoria and some in southern New South Wales, that 64% are close to the efficiency frontier, and only 36% really can lower that gap through improved performance. Now I interpret this as good news and bad news. The good news is Australian farmers have done a fantastic job of adopting technology, efficiently growing their crops and producing the yields they should achieve. They've really closed that gap and are doing a good job of utilising their resources to do that. That's the good news. The not so good news is that the opportunity to continue to do that, to continue to increase your production just by being more efficient and better at what you do, is declining. There's not much room to move in terms of what yields you can achieve given current technologies. And I'll come back to this. Now, how does that compare with Chinese wheat, maize, double crops? So there's China, and we've got a survey information in this part of there. This is the breadbasket of China, where you're growing wheat and maize, a double cropping system throughout the year, under irrigation, producing high yields. So Basically, it's wheat followed by maize, and this again represents this production frontier. So for the amount of nitrogen they're going to put on the crop, for the level of yield they're going to gain, and this is the production frontier of what they should achieve. The recommended rate is about 500 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, and they can get up to over 20 tonnes of grain production. That's over 2 crops. These figures here represent results from demonstration trials on farmers' fields run by researchers. So you can see in demonstration trials they're pretty close to what this production frontier is saying they should achieve. And then a survey of over 300 smallholder crops looks something like this. So you can see that there's an element of over-fertilising, people putting up to 1,000 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen, and not many people are achieving much greater than 15 tonnes per hectare when they should be looking at something like 20 tonnes per hectare. Let's contrast that with Zimbabwe. We've done a lot of work in Zimbabwe, and it's the other end of the spectrum. I guess you guys are shocked with numbers of 500 or 1,000 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen. In Zimbabwe, the norm is no fertiliser application, and the objective there is to try to get farmers to put on little bits of fertiliser. So this is some work done here that shows that if people recycle their seed, which is the common practice there, for their maize crops, they might get 600 or 700 kilograms per hectare. Open pollinated varieties, just changing varieties doesn't make much difference because the resources the soils are so resource poor, they've been run down so much in terms of their fertility. By just using a small amount of fertiliser, 17 kilograms per hectare, they can increase their yield significantly. Going to hybrids might make a little difference. The hybrid seed plus fertiliser, it does even more. So if we again look at this same framework, if we plot what the maize yields from a survey of close to 1,000 farmers, small farmers there, relative to the nitrogen availability, so this is not nitrogen fertiliser, this is the amount of nitrogen in the crop, relative to 3 different fertility levels, these are 3 different soils, you can see that there's a range of yields there for this very low level of fertility in their soils. But basically, you can categorise those systems of having low nitrogen and low yields. If we look at the situation where they went out and surveyed farmers that put on small amounts of fertiliser, you can see that the amount of nitrogen became available increased, but the performance of those systems didn't improve much. That yields remained low, and there was inefficient use of those resources. And then because of issues such as weeds and other management practices. So the point is here that if we look at it from a global perspective, what's happening, places like Africa are areas where there's still significant gains to be made by closing that yield gap. What you, as Australian farmers, have done over the last decades of closing yield gap can still play out in Africa. And that's one of the, when 50% of the world's food is produced locally, it's not traded, it's not put on ships, it's by small farmers producing and growing it themselves. This big increases in population, one of the potential saviours is these small farmers producing more efficiently and closing these yield gaps. So if we just look at this summary of the different pathways that we look forward. China has the opportunity, if this cloudy represents where Chinese farmers are now, they're over-investing in terms of how much inputs they're putting on their crops. That's due to a whole range of different reasons, partly through government subsidies for fertiliser production, through cultural reasons and others. So there's an opportunity for these Chinese farmers to both increase their production, to close the yield gap and put on less inputs. So that's a real win-win situation. In contrast, smallholder farms in places like Zimbabwe and most of sub-Saharan Africa, they need to both increase their investment in inputs and improve their farming practices to get closer to this efficiency frontier. And Australian farmers, as I said earlier, the analysis of the data that I'm seeing is that you've made the big gains. You've made the big gains in terms of using inputs. You've made the big gains in terms of closing the yield gap and how efficient and good your operations are. And so I think Australian farmers have got to look for technologies that are going to raise the attainable yield frontiers. What technologies out there are going to be able to do that? There's a lot of prospects, lots of research being done on different technologies that might be able to do this. And I've just put some of them up here. Technologies that will close this gap, technologies that will make how you use your resources more efficiently, and potential technologies that can do this, breaking this ceiling. And we're going to hear from Roberto a bit later about the role of GM, and I think that's where many people are thinking that it can contribute. So when I look for the Sustainable Agriculture flagship that I'm part of within CSIRO, where are we thinking that there's technology to come from? And so here's some ideas that I just wanted to throw up, and we're investing some of our research energies. Is these ideas for what we can do about evaporation. 60% of the water that falls on your farm is lost through evaporation. Is there technologies out there that can reduce that? A small reduction in the amount of soil evaporation can lead to big production increases. And there's lots of interest around biodegradable polymers and others that can form evaporation barriers. And I think that's a real prospective area. The idea of not just rotating in time, the idea that with precision planting and precision management techniques that you all have now, most of you have now with autosteer and GPS, the idea that you can get the benefits of rotation in space rather than time. So maybe plant your break crops and your cereal crops in the one season and manage them accordingly, so get the benefit in space as well as time. One of the areas that we've got a research program around is this idea of how do you deepen your topsoil. So at the moment, most of your phosphorus and your activities in a shallow depth near the surface, you know that moisture storage is important. So how do you increase the volume of soil that a plant can access? And so there's interest in not just tillage or implement ways of getting remedial approaches into depth. Is there other ways of doing it? And so the use of technologies such as nanotechnology, where you can coat gypsum or lime or any other amendment with a nanoparticle that has not charged, so it can flow down to the depth in the soil, dissolve, and you can have impacts at depth that will improve the rooting depth of your soil and the productivity of your soil. So there's real interest around what technology is going to allow us to get to make our soils perform better to depth. This here is new generation irrigation, particular approach and industry, but I think this holds more for anybody, is the use of ICT, information communication technologies. How do we use information better to manage our biophysical and potentially marketing risks into the future? And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Better integrating crops and livestock. For a while there was a strong driver from the research community and consultants, I think, to separate your enterprises. Don't put your livestock anywhere near your cropping lands, and because of this concept. But now with lots of work being done on grazing crops, grazing canola, grazing wheat, how can you better integrate enterprises to get the benefits at the farm level rather than just at the enterprise level? And I think a big one, I think a lot of people have been influenced by the last 2 years of these wet harvests or these wet seasons and the consequence of that. But the reality is Australian farmers, across Australia mostly, concentrate on the drying. The breeding programs, the management practices are about how do we do well when it's dry. And that's important. But if you do an analysis of performance, you'll find that mostly people underperform when the seasons are wet. And so what technologies are out there enable you to take advantage, so that when you have a season with a yield potential of 6 or 7 tonnes, how do you get much closer to that and achieve it? I wanted to ask Roberto, when he spoke about this adoption of no-till has been achieved. It was an amazing technology to get us close to those efficiency frontiers. But what's the next technology that's going to lead to the next innovation? And I think for Australia, where we farm in a variable climate, a very risky climate, it has to be around how do we better manage climate variability. And I'm a proponent and a believer in tools that allow farmers to get information that's going to change the odds about how you might manage a particular season. And one of these tools, as I mentioned earlier, is Your Profit. It's an online system that gives farmers an idea of if they invest today in fertiliser or a particular variety or whatever, what the likely outcome of that's going to be. Can you change the odds from just a flip of a coin to something in your favour? And so I think the use of information, communication technologies, decision support is a key component of our future farming systems. Another example of this is technologies such as virtual fencing. So CSIRO has been working on virtual fencing for the last 10 years. It's shown in research plots that it can work. That's where you don't put physical fences up, you put collars or equipment on the animals, and a bit like I think there's commercial services available for dogs, for pets, but you put this on commercial animals such as sheep and cattle, and you can control how those animals behave. So not just constrain them to a particular area, but be able to muster them and remotely move that mob of animals around. So there's, I think, lots of farmers when I talk to are very excited by the prospects in being able to do that in virtual fencing. So, to end up here, our track record, I'm an optimist. Where, as a researcher, we look at, I showed you those early graphs about what the challenge in terms of producing food is going to be in the future with increases in population and demand for food. We've done it in the past. We've had the first and second revolutions. The Green Revolution doubled global production of food, but with massive consequences. We did that by using 7 times the amount of nitrogen fertiliser, twice the amount of water, the amount of arable land per person declined. And we pumped a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Agriculture currently accounts for 40% of global emissions. And so when we look into the future, we can't take this same route. It can't be a continual use of inputs to drive that production into the future. It has to be more about our resource use efficiency. We have to be able to use the resources we got much more efficiently to get the same outcomes. And it has to be based on information science as we go into the future. I wanted to end up with a little story here that the Australian government is supporting the smallholder farms in Africa through a food security initiative that started a number of years ago. And this is some farmers in Burkina Faso growing cotton, hand picking it, they're picking it at the moment. And so these farmers are growing crops using pretty minimal technologies. But down the road, you can go and see another farmer here. That cotton behind him is GM cotton. That is the same cotton, or they're using the same technology as Australian farmers. He's selling his cotton on a global price for the same price that Australian farmers are receiving. And he's looking happy because I asked him, I said, how many wives do you have? And he said, because that number of wives is a signal of how successful he is as a farmer. He said 16. And then I said, well, how many children do you have? And he said, he turned to his son, standing beside him and asked him a question, came back and says, we don't know. So that is one of the issues facing the world today, is what's happening with population, and also how technology can help deliver